In 1879, a young boy just 16 years old left his family's farm behind and set out for Detroit. Back then, there were no highways or airplanes. People either rode trains or traveled by horse-drawn carriages. Cars, as we know them today, didn't really exist yet. The few that did were strange-looking machines, mostly seen as fancy toys for the wealthy or fast-racing gadgets. But this teenager, Henry Ford, would go on to change that forever. When he first arrived in Detroit, few could have imagined the future he would shape. Yet just 35 years later, half of all the cars in the world would carry his name. And the boy who once fixed watches and fled farm life would become one of the richest and most influential men in American history. This is the journey of the man who not only revolutionized how cars were built, but also how people lived, worked, and moved around the world.
Henry Ford was born on July 30th, 1863, on his family's farm near what is now Dearborn, Michigan. His father, William Ford, owned the land. And like many families at the time, everyone, parents, children, even extended relatives, worked together to keep the farm running. As the oldest of 6 children, Henry was expected to one day take over the family business. But from an early age, it was clear he wasn't interested in that life. While his father saw value in farming and hard labor, Henry felt no connection to the work. The long, slow, and physically demanding days in the field made him restless. He once said, "I never had any particular love for the farm. It was my mother I loved on the farm." That simple line showed just how disconnected he felt from the farming lifestyle and how close he was to his mother, Mary Ford. Like many children in rural areas, Henry didn't enjoy going to school. He stopped formal education after the 8th grade, not because he wasn't smart, but because he preferred to learn in his own way, by doing, experimenting, and exploring things that actually interested him. From a young age, that interest was mechanics. Henry was fascinated with how things worked. He would inspect every machine he came across, taking them apart mentally, and sometimes literally, to see what made them tick. When he was 12 years old, his father gave him a pocket watch. Most kids would have treasured it and kept it safe, but Henry had other ideas. He carefully disassembled the watch and figured out how to put it back together. It wasn't long before he was fixing watches for friends and neighbors. Before anyone realized it, young Henry had built a small reputation as the local watch repair kid. But his interest in machines didn't stop with tiny gears and springs. When he was 13, a school trip introduced him to something that would truly spark his imagination, a steam engine. He saw it for the first time during a visit to an industrial plant in Detroit. The size, the sound, the way it generated power, it fascinated him more than anything else ever had. From then on, Henry became obsessed with engines. By the time he was 15, he had already managed to build a basic steam engine himself. He used whatever scrap materials and spare parts he could find, learning mostly by trial and error. Every success, every failure, it all fueled his passion. But life took a painful turn that year. Henry's mother, Mary, passed away suddenly. The loss hit him hard. He had been incredibly close to her, and without her, the farm felt empty and cold. The chores he already disliked now became unbearable, each task a reminder of the person he missed most. His desire to leave the farm intensified. He knew he wanted something different, something bigger. So when he turned 16, Henry made a bold decision. Despite his father's disapproval, he left home to find a new path. He packed a small bag and traveled to Detroit, a city that was quickly becoming a hub for industrial innovation. Thanks to the rise of the steam engine, factories were opening up and looking for workers, especially young men who were willing to learn and get their hands dirty. Henry Ford had no formal training, no money, and no connections. But he had something just as valuable: curiosity, determination, and a burning love for machines. In the years that followed, those qualities would lead him down a road that changed the future, not just for him, but for the entire world. When Henry Ford left the farm at age 16, he wasn't just walking away from chores and plows. He was leaving behind the only life he had ever known. For most people in rural Michigan during the 1870s, the farm wasn't a choice. It was destiny. But Henry believed he could make a new kind of life, one shaped not by crops or livestock, but by gears, steam, and engines. He arrived in Detroit, a city that was slowly transforming into an industrial center. Factories were rising, machines were everywhere, and the streets buzzed with opportunity. It was noisy, crowded, and fast-moving. Everything the farm wasn't, but Henry was drawn to it. He felt like he had landed exactly where he belonged. Still, getting started wasn't easy. His first job was at a streetcar manufacturing plant called the Michigan Car Company Works, which built large railway cars. But despite how excited he was to be working in a factory, the job didn't last. He was fired after just 6 days. The reason wasn't well documented, but it likely had something to do with inexperience or simply not fitting in with the fast pace of production. For a while, Henry drifted from one odd job to another. He didn't give up. He was too determined for that. But he struggled to find stable footing. Eventually, he landed a new position as an apprentice at James Flower and Brothers Machine Shop. The pay was low, only $2.60 a week, but the experience was priceless. At that shop, Henry got to work closely with metal, engines, and tools, all of which deepened his understanding of mechanical systems. The problem was, $2.60 a week wasn't enough to live on, not in a city like Detroit. Rent, food, and basic necessities added up quickly. So Henry fell back on an old skill he had mastered years ago: watch repair. At night, after his shift at the machine shop, he took on a second job as a jeweler's assistant, where he cleaned and fixed watches for $3 a week. This meant he was working 6 nights a week, often until late, all while holding down his daytime apprenticeship. It was exhausting. Most people would have burned out or quit. But Henry Ford had a relentless work ethic, and he saw every minute on the job as another chance to learn. During whatever free time he had, he kept reading, observing, and tinkering with whatever mechanical devices he could get his hands on. His mind never stopped turning. By 1882, when he turned 19, Henry made the decision to return home to the family farm in Michigan. It wasn't because he had given up, quite the opposite. He had gained valuable skills in Detroit, but he needed more freedom to experiment. Back home, he now had access to tools, materials, and space, and he began spending hours in the barn testing ideas. His father, William Ford, had recently purchased a portable steam engine, which was becoming more common among local farmers. Henry became obsessed with the machine. He didn't just learn how to operate it, he mastered it. Word spread quickly around the region. Farmers started asking Henry to run their engines too. One neighbor even paid him $3 to operate his own steam tractor, which was a lot of money at the time. That small job turned into something bigger. People from surrounding towns began hiring Henry to install, fix, and operate steam engines, and soon he was traveling throughout Michigan with tools in hand. His name became known among farmers and factory owners alike as a young man who could make machines work better than anyone else. His growing reputation eventually caught the attention of the Westinghouse Engine Company, one of the major manufacturers of steam engines based in New York. Their local representative in Michigan heard about Henry and offered him a job. Now, instead of just operating steam engines, Henry would be paid to install and service them across southern Michigan. It was his first serious engineering role, and it changed everything. Henry now had real clients, technical responsibilities, and access to the latest machinery. He wasn't just learning from books anymore. He was living inside the world of industrial mechanics, solving problems on the spot, building relationships, and gaining confidence in his ability to turn mechanical ideas into real working systems. During this period of growth in his career, Henry also experienced a milestone in his personal life. In 1885, at a New Year's Eve party, he met Clara Jane Bryant. The two hit it off, and within a year, they were engaged. Clara was smart, supportive, and grounded, qualities that would prove essential in the chaotic years to come. They married in 1888, and as a wedding gift, William Ford gave his son 40 acres of farmland, but Henry had no intention of turning it into a traditional farm. To him, the land was an opportunity, a place to build, experiment, and maybe even invent. He still didn't know exactly where he was headed, but one thing was clear: Henry Ford was never going back to farming. By the early 1890s, Henry and Clara Ford were living in a modest apartment in Detroit, far removed from the farmland he had once detested. But while his living situation was humble, his ideas were becoming larger than life. Henry's mind had moved far beyond steam engines, and it all began with a small article in a British magazine. One evening, while flipping through the pages, Henry came across a feature on a new kind of engine, the gasoline-powered internal combustion engine. It was being developed in Europe, mostly in Germany, by an inventor named Nicholas Otto. What set it apart from the steam engines Henry was used to was how fast, light, and efficient it was. Unlike steam engines, which took time to build pressure before starting, this gas engine could power itself instantly thanks to internal combustion, a process where fuel ignites inside the engine rather than externally. Henry was immediately fascinated. The idea of an engine that didn't need a boiler, didn't require long startup times, and could be compact enough to power small vehicles was revolutionary. He just had one problem. He didn't understand how it worked, at least not yet, and he wasn't alone. At the time, gas engines were practically unknown in America. Henry began asking around, and eventually located someone in the city who had managed to acquire one. The moment he saw it in action, he was hooked. He knew this engine was the future. But the more he looked into it, the more questions he had, especially about how the engine produced an electric spark to ignite the fuel-air mixture. Determined to learn everything he could, Henry took a job with the Edison Illuminating Company, the top electric utility company in Detroit. He started in 1891 as a night engineer, earning $40 a month. The company was owned by none other than Thomas Edison, who was already a legend in the world of electricity and innovation. Although Henry never worked directly under Edison at this stage, he was now surrounded by complex machinery and exposed to cutting-edge electrical systems every day. His main job was to monitor and repair the steam engines that powered Detroit's electric generators. When the engines were running smoothly, which was often, he had plenty of downtime, and he made the most of it. Henry spent his off hours studying electricity, tinkering with circuits, and slowly teaching himself the relationship between engines and power. Then came 1893, a year that would change his life forever. First, he and Clara welcomed their only son, Edsel Bryant Ford, into the world. Just 3 months later, Henry's hard work at Edison paid off. He was promoted to chief engineer, with a huge raise to $100 a week. That same year, Henry built his first working gas-powered engine in a small workshop behind his home. It was noisy, simple, and crude, but it ran. This moment marked the true beginning of his mission to build a horseless carriage. Henry's garage experiments grew more ambitious. He started designing a frame for the engine, using bits and pieces from bicycles, scrap wood, and whatever he could find. The result was the quadricycle, completed in the early hours of June 4th, 1896. It had 4 wire wheels, a simple gasoline engine, and a body that looked more like 2 bikes welded together than an actual car. Still, it ran. The quadricycle had 2 forward gears but no reverse, and worst of all, it had no cooling system. After running for just a short time, the engine would overheat. But Henry wasn't discouraged. He saw it not as a finished product, but as proof of concept. He kept refining the machine, adding a cooling system, and making other tweaks. Eventually, he sold the quadricycle for $200, which he reinvested into building an improved model. He wasn't selling a product yet. He was still exploring, learning, evolving. What made this period so special was Henry's ability to teach himself not just the mechanics of the engine, but the science and logic behind it. Every failure taught him something. Every late-night session in the garage brought him one step closer to his vision. But one thing was clear: he couldn't go much further on his own. If he was going to build real cars and bring them to market, he needed backers, materials, and a team. And that meant taking his invention beyond the workshop and into the business world. With the success of the quadricycle, Henry Ford now had something real. Proof that a gasoline-powered vehicle could be built and driven, even if it was still rough around the edges. But as much as he enjoyed experimenting in his workshop, Henry knew he needed to take the next step, turning his idea into a business. He began building a second version of his car, this one larger and sturdier than the first. As he worked, he started to gain attention from people in Detroit who were curious about this young man and his strange, self-propelled machines. One of those people was William Murphy, a wealthy lumber merchant with money to invest and a growing interest in automobiles. Henry took Murphy for a test drive in his newly built vehicle, and by the end of the ride, Murphy was convinced. He offered to back Henry financially, and in August of 1899, they formed the Detroit Automobile Company. At first, everything looked promising. With proper funding and a real factory, Henry finally had the resources to pursue his dream of manufacturing cars. But what he didn't expect was how different building a company would be from building a machine. Problems surfaced almost immediately. Henry wanted to spend his time perfecting the design, constantly tweaking and improving the cars before they were released. But his investors, including Murphy, wanted results. They were thinking about profits, not perfection. They pressured him to mass-produce passenger vehicles and to do it quickly, while Henry insisted on going back to the drawing board with every flaw he noticed. There were also supply issues. Many of the parts needed to build his cars came from different suppliers. If one shipment was late, the entire factory had to pause. Cars took months to complete, and production crawled along. The company only managed to produce 20 cars over 2 years, and most were heavy, slow, and not very reliable. The Detroit Automobile Company collapsed in less than 2 years. Investors were frustrated, money was gone, and Henry was forced out of his own business. But surprisingly, Henry wasn't discouraged. If anything, he felt relieved. In his eyes, the company's failure gave him freedom. Freedom to work on his own terms without corporate interference. He famously said, "Failure is simply the opportunity to begin again, this time more intelligently." And that's exactly what he did. Henry took a step back and began focusing on something new: racing cars. At the time, car racing was becoming a major sport in the US. Crowds would gather to watch these early machines roar down dirt roads, and races were being used as a way for manufacturers to showcase their vehicles' speed and durability. Henry realized that racing wasn't just a sport, it was a marketing opportunity. He teamed up with Tom Cooper, a well-known cyclist, and together they built a race car. In 1901, Henry's machine, powered by 26 horsepower, went head-to-head against the car of Alexander Winton, one of the biggest names in early American auto manufacturing. To everyone's surprise, Ford's car won. The victory made headlines. Suddenly, investors were interested again. Soon after, a group of new backers approached Henry, and in 1903, they helped him launch a new business, the Ford Motor Company. This time, Henry was more cautious, but even now, his future at the company wasn't guaranteed. Despite being its founder and chief engineer, Henry's passion for building race cars still clashed with what investors wanted: affordable, practical cars for everyday people. Eventually, tensions came to a head. The investors grew tired of Henry's obsession with racing and brought in another man, Henry Martin Leland, to replace him and steer the company toward commercial production. Henry was furious. In his own words, "I resigned, determined never again to put myself under orders." He walked away from the company he had started. After he left, the investors renamed the business the Cadillac Motor Company, a name that still exists today. But Henry wasn't done yet. Still teamed with Tom Cooper, he built a new race car, this time called the Ford 999. It was massive, built for power and speed. In 1902, they handed it over to a little-known bicycle racer named Barney Oldfield, who had never driven a car before. That didn't matter. The 999th crushed its competition, breaking speed records and drawing even more attention to Henry's engineering skills. By 1904, another version of the car hit 91.4 miles per hour, breaking American speed records and proving beyond a doubt that Henry Ford was a mechanical genius. With his growing fame and a proven track record, Henry was able to secure the backing of 11 investors, including a Detroit coal dealer named Alexander Malcolmson. Together, they launched what would become Henry's third and final automotive company. At first, it was called Ford and Malcolmson Limited, but not long after, it was officially renamed the Ford Motor Company, a name that would soon become known in every corner of the world. This time, Henry wasn't just trying to build another car. He had a clear vision: to make a vehicle that the average person could afford, not just the rich. He was tired of automobiles being treated as luxury items. To him, they should be practical, reliable, and for everyone. By the time Henry Ford launched his third attempt at a car company in 1903, he wasn't just starting over, he was starting smarter. This wasn't the eager young inventor of the Detroit Automobile Company who let investors run the show. This time, Henry had a vision, and he was determined to stick to it. With Alexander Malcolmson and 10 other investors by his side, Ford Motor Company was born. Though it was originally called Ford and Malcolmson Limited, the name was soon changed to reflect Henry's growing public recognition. Henry made it clear from the beginning, he wasn't interested in building fancy cars for the rich. He wanted to design a vehicle for ordinary people, something simple, reliable, and affordable. It was a bold move, especially at a time when automobiles were still seen as luxury items or racing novelties. But Henry was convinced that cars could become an everyday necessity, as essential as shoes. To make that happen, he knew he needed the right people. Henry had a gift not only for building machines, but also for spotting talent. He brought in a group of bright young engineers who believed in his vision and were willing to challenge the norms of auto manufacturing. Henry and his team began designing their first car under the new company. After several failed prototypes and endless tweaks, they finally completed a working model, the Model A. It was far from perfect, but it marked the beginning of Ford's production lineup. Over the next 5 years, Henry launched several improved versions, including the Model N, which became a surprising hit. But the real magic wasn't just in the cars themselves. It was in how they were being built. From his earlier failures, Henry had learned the dangers of depending on too many outside suppliers. He realized that if he wanted to build cars quickly and affordably, he needed better control over the entire manufacturing process. He began partnering with machine shops in Detroit, trying to consolidate operations. But the real breakthrough came during a visit to a Chicago slaughterhouse, of all places. There, Henry saw an assembly line in action, animals being processed step by step, with each worker performing a specific task. It was grim, but efficient. At that time, Ford, like most car makers, was building vehicles one at a time. It was slow, expensive, and required skilled workers who could do everything from start to finish. But if Henry could break the process into smaller steps, with each worker doing just one job, he could dramatically speed up production. In 1904, Henry raised more money and opened a larger factory in Detroit. He hired over 300 workers and began experimenting with the assembly line concept. The early versions were rough and constantly being tweaked. But by 1906, the results were already impressive. Production of the Model N had increased fivefold, making it one of the best-selling cars in America at the time. Still, Henry wasn't satisfied. He wanted something more, something iconic. In the background, he and his team had been working on an all-new vehicle, one that would fulfill his dream of an affordable, durable, easy-to-drive car for the masses. The secret to that breakthrough came from a new kind of material, vanadium steel. This steel was stronger and 3 times lighter than traditional metals. It gave Ford's designers more flexibility, allowing them to build tougher cars without adding weight. Henry seized on this innovation and incorporated it into a brand new model, the car that would change the world. In 1908, Ford Motor Company unveiled the Model T. It was simple in design, but incredibly practical. It could handle rough roads, was easy to maintain, and, most importantly, it was built using methods that made it far more affordable than anything else on the market. At launch, the price was $850, around $21,000 today. And while that was still a lot of money at the time, it was far cheaper than other cars being sold. Public response was overwhelming. Within days, 15,000 orders were placed. The Model T became so popular, it didn't just sell, it defined what a car should be. Ford Motor Company shot to the top of the industry, and Henry knew he needed more room to grow. In 1910, he opened a new, massive factory in Highland Park, Michigan. It would become the heart of his manufacturing empire. There, after years of refining his process, Henry perfected the moving assembly line. Instead of workers walking around the factory to build the car would come to them, moving down a track from station to station. By 1913, the system was fully operational. The results were staggering. What used to take 12 hours to build could now be completed in just 90 minutes. Production rates soared, and by 1914, Ford was producing over 300,000 cars a year, more than all other car companies combined. And that was just the beginning. By the time Ford Motor Company perfected its moving assembly line in 1913, the automotive world and manufacturing in general would never be the same again. Henry Ford didn't invent the assembly line, but he was the first person to apply it so efficiently to building automobiles that it transformed industry itself. At Ford's Highland Park plant, cars no longer sat stationary while workers moved around them. Now, the vehicles moved down a track, with each worker responsible for just one or two specific tasks. Instead of building an entire car, a worker might only install the steering wheel, or bolt on the wheels, or hook up the fuel tank. These tasks were fast, repeatable, and required far less training. The results were astonishing. Before the assembly line, building a single Model T took around 12 hours. With the new system, that time dropped to 90 minutes. And because the process was so much faster and more consistent, the cost of each car dropped dramatically. As production increased, prices fell. Henry Ford was determined to make the Model T truly affordable for the average American. In 1916, the price dropped from $850 to under $400. For many families, this meant that owning a car was no longer a dream. It was possible. By that year, half of all cars in the world were Fords, most of them Model Ts. But this innovation came with growing pains. The assembly line made production faster, but it also made work more repetitive, and for some, boring. Skilled craftsmen, who once prided themselves on building an entire car from start to finish, were now reduced to tightening the same bolt dozens of times a day. Turnover skyrocketed. Many workers quit within weeks or even days. Henry Ford saw the problem and came up with a solution that shocked the entire business world. In 1914, he doubled the average factory wage from $2.50 to $5 a day, a move that many business leaders called insane. Critics said it would bankrupt the company, but Henry saw it differently. If workers were better paid, they'd stay longer, work harder, and, most importantly, they could afford to buy the very products they were building. The results spoke for themselves. Mechanics and laborers from all over the country came to Detroit in search of a job at Ford. Turnover dropped, production increased even more, and the company quickly became a model for other industries. Suddenly, the idea of paying workers well wasn't just good ethics, it was good business. Ford also shortened the workday from 9 hours to 8 and added a third shift. Now, his factories could operate 24 hours a day, non-stop. The American manufacturing economy would never go back to the old way. As Henry put it, a business absolutely devoted to service will have only one worry about profits. They will be embarrassingly large. Ford didn't stop innovating there. In 1919, tired of butting heads with shareholders who didn't always support his ideas, he made a massive move. He bought out every single investor in the company, making himself the sole owner of Ford Motor Company. The move created a wave of new millionaires across Detroit, but it also gave Henry total control. He installed his son, Edsel Ford, as president of the company, but everyone knew who really ran the show. For a while, everything was going right. Ford's Highland Park plant became known as the Crystal Palace, a symbol of efficiency, modernity, and American progress. The Model T was so dominant that General Motors and Chrysler scrambled just to stay in the game. But there was a storm brewing on the horizon, one that no amount of production speed or price cuts could fix. As the 1920s rolled in, the world was changing, and Henry Ford's unwillingness to adapt was about to catch up with him. By the early 1920s, Henry Ford was on top of the world. The Model T had become a cultural icon. His factories were pumping out cars faster than anyone could match, and Ford Motor Company was a symbol of American industrial power. At one point, half of all cars on Earth were Fords. He had revolutionized transportation, created thousands of jobs, and turned the average man into a driver. But there was one problem. Henry Ford refused to move on. While other companies, like General Motors and Chevrolet, were releasing new models with sleeker designs, more comfort, and better features, Henry insisted that the Model T was all people needed. Even as demand started to shift, he kept production focused on the same car he had introduced in 1908, a car that, by now, was starting to feel outdated. His son, Edsel Ford, along with other executives, urged him to develop a new model, something modern and stylish to compete with the growing number of alternatives. But Henry wouldn't budge. He believed the Model T was practical, affordable, and reliable, and that was enough. For years, he ignored declining sales and dismissed advice from those around him. But the numbers didn't lie. As the 1920s came to an end, Ford's dominance began to slip. Chevrolet had overtaken Ford in annual sales. Customers wanted variety, color options, updated interiors, things Henry had no interest in offering. Eventually, reality forced his hand. In 1927, after nearly 2 decades and over 15 million Model Ts sold, Ford finally shut down the Model T production line. It was the end of an era. He announced a new vehicle, the Model A. This wasn't just a tweak or an update. It was a complete redesign, featuring more power, better styling, and modern features. But this time, Henry made another bold move. He didn't just want a new car, he wanted a new kind of factory. He built an enormous new production complex along the Rouge River in Michigan. It was his most ambitious project yet. The idea was to control the entire manufacturing process from start to finish. The factory included its own steel mill, glass plant, rubber processing, and everything else needed to make a car, all under one roof. It became the largest integrated factory in the world at the time. From raw materials to final assembly, everything happened in one place. It was Henry Ford's vision of total industrial independence come to life. But Ford's one-man leadership style, which had once pushed the company to the top, was now starting to hold it back. As competitors adapted to trends and consumer demands, Henry's stubbornness became a liability. The success of the V8 engine, which was introduced in the early 1930s, brought a boost, but it wasn't enough to fully reclaim Ford's lead. And then came the Great Depression. Sales plummeted. The economy tanked. Ford, like most companies, was forced to lay off thousands of workers and cut wages. His once celebrated factories grew quieter, and the shine of innovation began to fade. Ford's resistance to change wasn't just hurting sales, it was hurting morale. In 1943, tragedy struck. Edsel Ford, Henry's only son and the acting president of the company, died of stomach cancer. Edsel had long been seen as the bridge between his father's old ways and a more modern future. His death left Henry devastated. For a time, Henry stepped back in to manage the company himself, even though he was nearing 80. But age and health were catching up with him, and his decisions became more erratic. Finally, in 1945, he passed control of the company to his grandson, Henry Ford II. 2 years later, on April 7, 1947, Henry Ford died of a cerebral hemorrhage. He was 83 years old. His legacy, however, was already sealed. He had taken an idea, a car for the common man, and turned it into a worldwide movement. He changed not just transportation, but also how products were made, how workers were paid, and how businesses operated. He helped create the middle class by making mobility accessible and jobs more stable. Today, Ford Motor Company remains one of the largest car makers in the world, with a value of around $70 billion. Its name still stands for American ingenuity, perseverance, and bold ideas. Henry Ford wasn't perfect. He made mistakes. He resisted change, but he also reshaped the 20th century with a vision so strong it still drives the world forward. As he once said, "Life is a series of experiences, each one of which makes us bigger." We must learn that the setbacks and griefs we endure help us in our marching onward. And that's exactly what Henry Ford did. March onward from a boy on a farm to one of the most influential industrialists in human history.